Senator John Kennedy leaned into the microphone and said, with that calm Louisiana sweetness that feels polite until you hear the blade inside it, that Adam Schiff seemed to treat national security like a stage prop and truth like optional lighting. The room reacted the way audiences always react when a sentence lands like a slap, but is delivered like a compliment, because the contrast makes it feel even sharper. Adam Schiff's jaw tightened as the cameras did what cameras always do in Washington, which is sprint toward conflict like it's oxygen. A few people in the gallery gasped, not because they had never heard an insult in a hearing room, but because John Kennedy made it sound like a diagnosis. And for a beat, Adam Schiff looked like someone realizing a debate was about to become a cross-examination instead of a performance. From the back row, a woman whispered loud enough for the mic to catch it, asking why John Kennedy was coming at Adam Schiff so hard, and whether this was personal or political. John Kennedy didn't even turn around, because he understood the psychology of an audience as well as he understood the psychology of a witness. He said, almost warmly, that if she wanted the reason, she should stay to the end of the video, because the reason was not a punchline, but a chain. Adam Schiff tried to smirk, the way Adam Schiff smirks when he believes he can outlast the moment through posture alone. John Kennedy nodded as if he had just been handed permission to keep going, because that is what attention does to a prepared man. The Senate Intelligence Committee hearing room looked less like a workspace and more like a set designed to intimidate the truth into whispering. John Kennedy sat with his yellow legal pad, his glasses low on his nose, and his expression arranged in that familiar way that suggests confusion even when it is calculation. Adam Schiff sat rigid, shoulders squared, wire-rimmed glasses catching the overhead light, a practiced seriousness that reads as virtue when no one challenges it. The witness at the center table was supposed to be discussing surveillance reform, documentation discipline, and the procedural friction that keeps powerful tools from being abused. But John Kennedy and Adam Schiff were no longer orbiting the witness, because the gravity in the room had shifted toward ego, narrative, and consequence. Adam Schiff had spent the prior 10 minutes doing what Adam Schiff does best, which is turning a policy discussion into a moral drama where he is the lead prosecutor. He spoke with the cadence of a closing argument, pausing as though each pause carried the weight of a classified annex only he had read. He warned that John Kennedy's questions sounded like they were written by people who confuse suspicion with evidence and volume with credibility. He implied that John Kennedy was endangering institutions by repeating talking points that do not belong in a serious hearing. And he said it with the serenity of a man who enjoys being the adult in the room. John Kennedy listened without interrupting, which is how you can tell John Kennedy was not absorbing the speech but mapping it. When Adam Schiff finished, he settled back in his chair with the satisfaction of someone who believes he has won the optics before the substance even starts. John Kennedy looked down at his notes as if he were checking spelling, then looked up at Adam Schiff as if he were checking character. John Kennedy asked Adam Schiff, in a voice so gentle it sounded almost sleepy, whether Adam Schiff was quite done giving speeches for the cameras. A ripple went through the room, because everyone heard the same thing at once, which was John Kennedy calling Adam Schiff predictable without raising his volume. Adam Schiff began to answer, but John Kennedy cut in politely, and Adam Schiff realized politeness can be a weapon when it denies you control. John Kennedy thanked Adam Schiff for the lecture, and he said he appreciated anyone willing to explain things slowly to a simple country lawyer from Louisiana. The line earned a few tight smiles, because it sounded self-deprecating until you noticed Adam Schiff was the one being framed as a teacher who cannot stop talking. Adam Schiff tried to respond with a small laugh, but the laugh came out thin, like a gesture he did not fully believe in. John Kennedy reached down beside his chair and lifted a thick binder onto the desk, the kind that signals preparation rather than improvisation. Adam Schiff's eyes narrowed, because Adam Schiff recognized the visual language of a file that was not assembled for show, but for use. John Kennedy turned pages the way a surgeon selects tools, unhurried and precise, which is a pace that makes a confident witness feel trapped. Adam Schiff watched John Kennedy's hands move across tabs and markers, and Adam Schiff's face tightened with the subtle irritation of someone who expected to be the one controlling the agenda. John Kennedy said he had a few things he wanted Adam Schiff to help him understand, because Adam Schiff was always telling the country he understood everything first. The hearing room got quieter, not because everyone became respectful, but because everyone became curious in the same direction. Adam Schiff's staffers looked down at their phones as if they were suddenly busy, which is what people do when they sense their boss might need less visibility. John Kennedy began with a question that sounded simple, because John Kennedy understands that simple questions force complicated people to reveal their seams. John Kennedy asked Adam Schiff whether Adam Schiff believed reputations mattered when the government points at a citizen, even when no charges ever materialize. Adam Schiff started to answer with generalities, the familiar language of protecting institutions and respecting processes. But John Kennedy raised one finger and asked for something more specific. John Kennedy asked Adam Schiff whether Adam Schiff could admit plainly that public narratives can outlive corrections and that damage can persist even after official conclusions shift. Adam Schiff hesitated, and that hesitation mattered, because Adam Schiff's brand is certainty, and certainty does not pause unless it is calculating. John Kennedy said he was not asking Adam Schiff to confess to malice, because malice is a convenient argument that distracts from systems. John Kennedy said he was asking Adam Schiff to acknowledge a pattern where media certainty becomes political currency, and political currency becomes a substitute for careful restraint. Adam Schiff bristled, because Adam Schiff hears the word pattern as an accusation, and Adam Schiff hates accusations that come with structure. John Kennedy smiled slightly and said Adam Schiff should relax, because John Kennedy was going to keep the conversation inside verifiable lanes instead of drifting into rumor. Adam Schiff nodded stiffly, and the nod looked less like agreement and more like a man realizing the rules were being chosen for him. This was where the humor arrived, not as a joke that breaks tension, but as a joke that tightens it by making one side look too serious. John Kennedy told Adam Schiff that Adam Schiff's tone sounded like someone auditioning for his own documentary, and that even the committee chairs were starting to request intermissions. A few people chuckled, and Adam Schiff did not, because Adam Schiff understands laughter is a vote that cannot be whipped. John Kennedy apologized for the quip with such exaggerated courtesy that the apology felt like a second quip, and Adam Schiff's lips pressed together. The witness at the table stared forward like a man praying to become invisible, which is the most honest emotional posture in Washington. John Kennedy then pivoted to a controversial question that does not accuse a person of a crime, but does accuse a culture of indulgence. John Kennedy asked Adam Schiff whether Adam Schiff believed public officials should ever be punished for being wrong with confidence, even when they were technically acting within speech rights. Adam Schiff tried to turn it into a lecture about democracy and dissent, but John Kennedy asked again, slower, whether consequences should exist for reckless certainty. That question hung there because it is uncomfortable in both directions, and Adam Schiff could not answer without upsetting either accountability hawks or free speech purists. John Kennedy said softly that Adam Schiff had just discovered what it feels like to be trapped between slogans. Adam Schiff attempted to reclaim footing by warning that John Kennedy was flirting with narratives that energize people who do not care about facts. John Kennedy responded that Adam Schiff had spent years training the public to treat confidence as evidence, and that this training did not only occur on one side. Adam Schiff's eyebrows lifted, as if offended by the symmetry, because Adam Schiff prefers moral hierarchies to mutual critiques. John Kennedy said he was not equating motives, but he was comparing incentives, and incentives create behavior no matter how noble the speech sounds. Adam Schiff leaned toward the microphone, and John Kennedy leaned back, because John Kennedy likes to make the other person do the reaching. John Kennedy asked Adam Schiff whether Adam Schiff could agree that oversight is supposed to be boring, because boring usually means careful. Adam Schiff said oversight is serious, and John Kennedy said serious is not the same thing as theatrical, and Adam Schiff's face flushed slightly. John Kennedy said Adam Schiff often speaks as if disagreement itself is a moral defect, which is a habit that turns politics into religion. Adam Schiff snapped that protecting the country is not a game, and John Kennedy replied that no one said it was. But Adam Schiff kept auditioning like it was. The laugh that followed was smaller than before, but it landed harder because it came from people trying not to laugh at the wrong time. John Kennedy paused, then told Adam Schiff that this was the moment where audiences decide whether they are watching a hearing or a show. John Kennedy said he had no interest in humiliating Adam Schiff for sport, because humiliation is cheap and accountability is expensive. Adam Schiff looked skeptical, because Adam Schiff has built a career on assuming opponents are acting in bad faith, and that assumption is a shield. John Kennedy said Adam Schiff could keep the shield, but the record would still exist outside it, and the public would still have questions. Adam Schiff inhaled as if preparing a rebuttal, and John Kennedy's eyes stayed calm, because calm is how you signal that you have time. John Kennedy then offered the audience another line that felt like a tease, because John Kennedy understands retention better than most influencers. John Kennedy said the reason he criticized Adam Schiff at the start was not about personality, but about a pattern that ends with ordinary people paying costs. John Kennedy said, "If you watch until the end, you will see the pattern from beginning to end, because the pattern is the story, not the insult." Adam Schiff muttered that this was grandstanding, and John Kennedy replied that Adam Schiff should not throw stones at grandstanding while standing on a cable news pedestal. Adam Schiff's eyes narrowed, and John Kennedy's smile faded just enough to suggest the next section would be less playful. John Kennedy turned one more page in the binder and asked Adam Schiff a question that sounded like a simple request for clarification, which is how traps are built. John Kennedy asked Adam Schiff whether Adam Schiff believed it was appropriate to use absolute language in public when facts are still developing behind closed doors. Adam Schiff began to answer that leadership requires reassurance, and John Kennedy replied that reassurance becomes manipulation when it is not tethered to humility. John Kennedy asked Adam Schiff whether Adam Schiff could name one time Adam Schiff publicly corrected himself with the same intensity he used when he accused others. Adam Schiff stared at John Kennedy, and the silence did not feel like reflection, because it felt like searching for a safe answer. John Kennedy said he would make it easier for Adam Schiff, because John Kennedy knows when to offer a lifeline that looks like mercy and functions like pressure. John Kennedy said Adam Schiff could answer in principle, without naming events, and just say whether public officials owe audiences the discipline of correction. Adam Schiff said public officials should be accurate, and John Kennedy asked whether Adam Schiff agreed that accuracy includes correcting the record when certainty was oversold. Adam Schiff hesitated again, and John Kennedy nodded slowly, because John Kennedy was collecting hesitations like receipts. The committee chair shifted in his seat, because even chairs get uncomfortable when the script feels like it is slipping away from the institution. John Kennedy looked toward Adam Schiff and said, in a tone that was still polite but no longer playful, that the next part would get specific. Adam Schiff braced, because Adam Schiff could sense John Kennedy was about to move from atmosphere to instances, from personality to claims, from style to substance. John Kennedy reminded Adam Schiff that the point of this hearing was not for Adam Schiff to be admired or for John Kennedy to be clipped into a viral montage. John Kennedy said the point was to ask whether government power, surveillance power, and public narrative power can be used without leaving citizens with permanent scars. Adam Schiff stared forward, and John Kennedy turned the page, and the room became quiet, in the way it becomes quiet right before the first real blow lands. Senator John Kennedy kept his voice calm, because calm makes the other person's defensiveness look louder than it is. Adam Schiff tried to smile again, but the smile looked rehearsed, like a stage direction that no longer matched the scene. John Kennedy said he wanted to talk about what happens when a public narrative becomes a weapon, even if nobody in the room ever admits they meant it that way. Adam Schiff leaned forward, signaling he was ready to rebut. But John Kennedy did not give him the opening, because John Kennedy controls pace, like a prosecutor controls breathing. John Kennedy told Adam Schiff that audiences could forgive disagreement, but audiences never forgive being treated like they are stupid, and that was where this problem starts. A staffer in the back whispered that John Kennedy was being unfair, and John Kennedy answered without turning his head, because he wanted the remark to land as a general truth. John Kennedy said the clip at the beginning was sharp by design, and if anyone wanted the reason, they should keep watching to the end, because the reason is a sequence, not a slogan. Adam Schiff rolled his eyes slightly, which was the first time the mask slipped enough for people to notice it. John Kennedy said the funny thing about Washington is that the people who accuse everyone else of misinformation often speak with the least caution when the cameras are hot. Adam Schiff snapped that John Kennedy was playing to the crowd, and John Kennedy replied that Adam Schiff invented playing to the crowd and then tried to trademark it. John Kennedy lifted one page from his binder and did not read it yet, because suspense is not just for entertainment, it is also for discipline. Adam Schiff watched the page like it might bite him, because Adam Schiff understands the difference between a speech and a record. John Kennedy said he would start with a principle that even Adam Schiff could agree with, because agreement forces accountability to look bipartisan. John Kennedy asked Adam Schiff whether he believed surveillance should require strict accuracy, strict verification, and strict disclosure to courts, because rights do not come in political flavors. Adam Schiff said yes, of course, and John Kennedy nodded as if the room had just signed a contract out loud. John Kennedy said the reason he asked that question was because the country is tired of watching powerful people treat procedure like it is optional when the target is convenient. Adam Schiff tried to steer the conversation toward threats and foreign adversaries, but John Kennedy held it in place, insisting that rules matter most when fear is highest. John Kennedy said that if Adam Schiff truly cares about institutions, then Adam Schiff should care when institutions cut corners, even if the corners were cut in a direction Adam Schiff liked. Adam Schiff's mouth opened as if to object, then closed, because the framing was too reasonable to swat away without looking unreasonable. John Kennedy said Adam Schiff's biggest weakness is not intelligence, it is appetite. And Adam Schiff looked offended because appetite implies indulgence rather than duty. John Kennedy made the first of several controversial questions, each one designed to make Adam Schiff choose between branding and humility. John Kennedy asked Adam Schiff whether it is ethical to speak in absolutes on television when you know the underlying record is complex, disputed, or still evolving. Adam Schiff said he always speaks based on what he knows, and John Kennedy asked whether what Adam Schiff knows includes what Adam Schiff does not know. The room gave a quiet, nervous laugh because it sounded like a riddle, but it was really a trap door under Adam Schiff's certainty. John Kennedy said the public has a right to skepticism when a politician sells certainty like a subscription service. Adam Schiff tried to reclaim control by calling John Kennedy's approach irresponsible, and John Kennedy replied that irresponsibility is the word people use when they cannot refute structure. John Kennedy said Adam Schiff had just spent 10 minutes lecturing about responsibility, but had not once admitted the possibility of being wrong, which is the first responsibility. Adam Schiff bristled because he is used to being treated as the adult in the room, not the defendant in the room. John Kennedy said Adam Schiff's tone always assumes the listener is guilty of ignorance until Adam Schiff grants them permission to think. Adam Schiff scoffed, and John Kennedy smiled slightly, because scoffing is an emotion that looks like evidence to people who do not have evidence. John Kennedy's humor returned, but it returned like a scalpel, not like a party trick. John Kennedy told Adam Schiff that if moral certainty were a renewable resource, Adam Schiff could power half of California without a single solar panel. A few senators laughed, then stopped quickly as if they remembered they were supposed to look solemn, which made the moment funnier. Adam Schiff did not laugh at all, and John Kennedy said that was fine, because humor is usually wasted on people who take themselves too seriously to audit themselves. Adam Schiff accused John Kennedy of making light of serious issues, and John Kennedy replied that Adam Schiff makes light of serious issues every time he turns them into theater. John Kennedy then shifted from mood to method, because method is what separates a viral rant from an argument. John Kennedy said he would speak carefully because this was being recorded, and because he was not interested in telling fairy tales to people who deserve facts. Adam Schiff seized on that line, claiming John Kennedy was admitting he traffics in rumors, and John Kennedy corrected him instantly, saying the opposite, that the standard would be public record and reasonable inference. John Kennedy said that if Adam Schiff could point to anything inaccurate, John Kennedy would welcome the correction, but Adam Schiff should be prepared to be specific, not dramatic. Adam Schiff nodded stiffly, because specificity is the one place where performance does not help you. John Kennedy asked Adam Schiff to confirm one more principle, because principle is the doorway to consequence. John Kennedy asked whether Adam Schiff agrees that government actors should not hide exculpatory context when presenting a narrative to the public, even if the context makes the story messier. Adam Schiff said context matters, and John Kennedy nodded again, because Adam Schiff had just handed him another spoken contract. John Kennedy said Americans are tired of being sold simple stories that flatter one side and demonize the other, because those stories are emotional sugar and civic poison. Adam Schiff tried to interrupt, but John Kennedy raised a hand, not aggressively, just enough to signal that Adam Schiff would not be allowed to dominate airtime by volume. John Kennedy said Adam Schiff likes to accuse others of conspiracy thinking. But Adam Schiff sometimes offers certainty that functions the same way in reverse. Adam Schiff snapped that he deals in evidence. And John Kennedy said then this should be easy, because evidence is not allergic to scrutiny. John Kennedy asked Adam Schiff whether Adam Schiff believes the public trust has been damaged by how political figures speak about law enforcement and intelligence agencies for partisan advantage. Adam Schiff said yes, trust has been damaged by reckless rhetoric, and John Kennedy said he agreed, then asked why Adam Schiff never seems to include himself in that category. Adam Schiff's face tightened, and John Kennedy let the tightness sit there, because letting discomfort breathe is a form of persuasion. John Kennedy paused long enough that people leaned in, and then he made the room picture something uncomfortable without accusing Adam Schiff of a specific crime. John Kennedy said, "Imagine you are an ordinary citizen, and powerful people imply you are a national security threat. And then later nobody can show a charge, but your name stays stained anyway." Adam Schiff tried to say the system has safeguards, and John Kennedy replied that safeguards are not magic, because they fail when leaders use narrative pressure instead of restraint. John Kennedy asked Adam Schiff whether Adam Schiff believes people should ever compensate the innocent for reputational destruction when official power was used irresponsibly. Adam Schiff attempted to dodge, and John Kennedy said this dodge is why the public thinks Washington is a machine that never pays for its own mistakes. A senator on the panel cleared his throat, and John Kennedy glanced at him as if to say, "This is not a detour, this is the point." John Kennedy said Adam Schiff often speaks as if being on the right side of history excuses being careless in the present. Adam Schiff shot back that John Kennedy is trying to rewrite history, and John Kennedy replied that he is trying to stop politicians from rewriting reality in real time. John Kennedy asked Adam Schiff whether Adam Schiff recognizes that audiences now distrust not only politicians, but the institutions politicians claim to defend, because politicians drag those institutions into narrative wars. Adam Schiff said distrust is dangerous, and John Kennedy said yes. And now we are going to talk about who fed it, because it did not feed itself. John Kennedy looked directly at Adam Schiff and said, "The public sees two versions of Adam Schiff, and that contradiction is where credibility dies." John Kennedy said one Adam Schiff claims to be sober, careful, and evidence-based, and the other Adam Schiff performs certainty on television like certainty is a shield. Adam Schiff protested that leadership requires clarity, and John Kennedy replied that clarity without humility is propaganda with good diction. John Kennedy asked Adam Schiff whether Adam Schiff can admit that political incentives reward the most dramatic version of a story, not the most accurate version. Adam Schiff hesitated, and John Kennedy said the hesitation answers more than Adam Schiff's words ever could. John Kennedy then offered another controversial question that forces the audience to pick sides in their own head, which is how you get comments, not just clicks. John Kennedy asked whether the modern political class has become addicted to scandal language, because scandal language makes fundraising easier and governance harder. Adam Schiff tried to laugh it off, but it came out strained, and John Kennedy said that laugh sounded like someone who recognized himself in the description. John Kennedy said the real debate here is not left versus right. It is accountability versus immunity. And Adam Schiff's career has often benefited from immunity. Adam Schiff objected, and John Kennedy said, "If you want to call that unfair, stay to the end, because the end is where the sequence shows its shape." John Kennedy turned the binder slightly so the cameras could see the tabs, because visuals matter, and he was not pretending otherwise. Adam Schiff's eyes tracked the tabs, and the audience could feel Adam Schiff calculating which category might be most dangerous. John Kennedy said he would proceed carefully, because he did not want to make claims he could not defend in public, and he would not ask the audience to trust him blindly. John Kennedy said the reason he criticized Adam Schiff in the opening hook was because Adam Schiff repeatedly asks the public to trust him blindly, and then gets angry when they do not. Adam Schiff stared at John Kennedy, and John Kennedy said, "We are going to walk through this step by step, because that is how trust is rebuilt, one documented moment at a time." Senator John Kennedy did not raise his voice when he said this was the point where rhetoric meets record, because volume is for people who lack patience. Adam Schiff shifted in his chair as if preparing for a rebuttal. But John Kennedy reminded him that rebuttals work better after facts are placed on the table. John Kennedy said the public keeps hearing about trust, but rarely hears about repair. And repair requires acknowledging harm without hiding behind process language. Adam Schiff said harm is subjective, and John Kennedy replied that consequences are not, because lost credibility and public confusion show up in data whether politicians like it or not. The room grew quiet again, not in reverence, but in recognition that this conversation was moving from tone to traceable impact. John Kennedy said he wanted to talk about certainty, because certainty is seductive on television and dangerous in governance. Adam Schiff argued that leadership demands confidence, and John Kennedy agreed, but added that confidence becomes deception when it refuses to downgrade itself as facts evolve. John Kennedy asked Adam Schiff whether Adam Schiff could recall a moment when he publicly recalibrated his certainty with the same intensity he used to project it. Adam Schiff began to say that updates happen quietly, and John Kennedy replied that quiet corrections do not undo loud declarations. A few heads nodded because everyone in the room understood how attention works, even if they pretend not to. John Kennedy then made a point that sounded almost sympathetic, which made it harder to dismiss. John Kennedy said, Adam Schiff operates inside incentives that reward morale theater and punish hesitation, and that this system pressures people to speak beyond what they can responsibly prove. Adam Schiff bristled at the word theater, and John Kennedy clarified that theater is not fake, it is curated, and curated narratives can still mislead. John Kennedy said, the problem is not that Adam Schiff speaks, but that Adam Schiff speaks as if doubt itself is disqualifying. Adam Schiff frowned, because doubt is the one thing his brand has never made room for. John Kennedy leaned back slightly and told the audience this was why the opening hook was sharp, because sharpness cuts through complacency. A voice from the gallery asked again why Adam Schiff deserved this level of scrutiny, and John Kennedy answered that scrutiny follows power like a shadow. John Kennedy said, if you want the full explanation, stay to the end, because the explanation is cumulative and cannot be reduced to a slogan without lying to you. Adam Schiff looked irritated, because audience engagement is usually his territory. John Kennedy smiled faintly, because irritation is a sign that the spotlight has shifted. John Kennedy said he would now describe a familiar cycle without accusing Adam Schiff of illegal conduct, because this was about norms, not indictments. John Kennedy described how a claim is made with confidence, repeated with authority, amplified by friendly outlets, and defended as truth long after its edges fray. Adam Schiff objected that this happens on all sides, and John Kennedy agreed, which is why the standard must apply to everyone, not just opponents. John Kennedy said the public senses when accountability is selective, and selective accountability destroys trust faster than any foreign actor ever could. Adam Schiff crossed his arms, a physical cue that signaled defense rather than engagement. John Kennedy asked Adam Schiff whether Adam Schiff believes trust is rebuilt by insisting people misunderstood him or by admitting when language overshot evidence. Adam Schiff answered that misinterpretation is a constant risk, and John Kennedy replied that risk is not an excuse to ignore outcomes. John Kennedy said, people do not stop trusting institutions because of complexity. They stop trusting because they feel manipulated by certainty that later evaporates. Adam Schiff tried to say that the public must be educated, and John Kennedy countered that education starts with modeling restraint. The witness at the table looked down again because restraint is not contagious in Washington. John Kennedy's humor surfaced briefly because humor keeps an audience breathing during heavy moments. John Kennedy said, Adam Schiff speaks like a man who believes footnotes are optional once applause starts, and the room gave a restrained chuckle. Adam Schiff protested that his record speaks for itself, and John Kennedy said records only speak when someone reads them without filters. John Kennedy apologized for the jab, then added that jokes work because they expose truths people already sense but hesitate to say. Adam Schiff did not accept the apology, which made it feel like a third jab. John Kennedy turned a page in the binder without reading it aloud, because anticipation is part of persuasion. Adam Schiff watched the movement with visible tension, because he knew this section would no longer be abstract. John Kennedy said before getting specific, he wanted Adam Schiff to acknowledge a baseline principle about public power and private consequence. John Kennedy asked whether Adam Schiff agreed that when officials speak, ordinary people absorb the message as guidance, not as debate club rhetoric. Adam Schiff said public discourse is nuanced, and John Kennedy replied that nuance disappears when authority speaks in absolutes. John Kennedy then asked a question designed to spark comments as much as thought. John Kennedy asked whether the political class has grown comfortable outsourcing moral certainty to television segments rather than institutional discipline. Adam Schiff said media is how Americans learn. And John Kennedy said media is also how Americans are misled when officials confuse persuasion with proof. John Kennedy said this confusion is why audiences now treat every confident claim as provisional, even when it is accurate. Adam Schiff frowned because he could not deny the distrust without owning some of its origins. John Kennedy paused and let the silence work, because silence forces viewers to project themselves into the gap. John Kennedy said Adam Schiff often frames disagreement as danger, which discourages honest inquiry and trains people to self-censor. Adam Schiff pushed back that misinformation is dangerous, and John Kennedy agreed, then asked whether exaggeration wears the same costume. John Kennedy said exaggeration may feel righteous in the moment, but it corrodes credibility over time. Adam Schiff shifted again, because time is not friendly to narratives that refuse revision. John Kennedy said this was where the public starts asking uncomfortable questions that politicians prefer to avoid. John Kennedy asked whether Adam Schiff believes the country would be healthier if leaders spoke with calibrated uncertainty instead of theatrical confidence. Adam Schiff answered that uncertainty can paralyze action, and John Kennedy replied that false certainty paralyzes trust. John Kennedy said Americans can handle complexity, but they cannot handle being sold a storyline that later collapses without accountability. Adam Schiff stared forward, and the room felt the weight of a conversation no longer controlled by press releases. John Kennedy reminded Adam Schiff that this hearing was not a popularity contest, even though Adam Schiff often speaks as if ratings matter. Adam Schiff accused John Kennedy of grandstanding again, and John Kennedy responded that grandstanding without evidence is theater, but grandstanding with evidence is uncomfortable education. John Kennedy said discomfort is not a violation of decorum. It is often the price of honesty. Adam Schiff sighed audibly, and John Kennedy took that as consent to continue. The audience leaned in, because the argument was now less about who was right and more about who was willing to answer. John Kennedy said he would move from principles to sequence, because principles without sequence feel safe, but change nothing. Adam Schiff braced because sequence implies chronology, and chronology implies receipts. John Kennedy said the reason he criticized Adam Schiff in the opening was not to humiliate him, but to wake viewers up to patterns they had normalized. John Kennedy said, if you stay to the end, you will see why those patterns matter to people who never appear on cable news. Adam Schiff looked at the binder again, and everyone understood that the next section would stop being theoretical. Senator John Kennedy said this was where abstraction ends, because abstraction is comfortable and specifics make people nervous. Adam Schiff straightened his papers as if paper could serve as armor, and John Kennedy noticed without commenting. John Kennedy reminded the room that he was not alleging crimes, because allegations trigger defenses instead of reflection. John Kennedy said he was describing a sequence of public behavior and public consequence, which is the only lane voters can actually judge. Adam Schiff nodded stiffly, because sequence is harder to dismiss than accusation. John Kennedy said the first step in the sequence is confidence delivered before verification has fully matured. Adam Schiff responded that leaders must speak when the moment demands clarity, and John Kennedy agreed, then added that clarity should not be confused with certainty. John Kennedy said, certainty locks people into positions they later defend out of pride, rather than evidence. Adam Schiff tried to counter with urgency, and John Kennedy replied that urgency is not a license to oversell. The audience murmured, because everyone had seen urgency used as an excuse before. John Kennedy then explained how confidence becomes repetition, and repetition becomes perceived truth. Adam Schiff objected that repetition does not equal proof, and John Kennedy agreed, which is why repetition without correction becomes manipulation. John Kennedy said Adam Schiff has mastered the art of repeating a position until it feels settled, even while the underlying record remains unsettled. Adam Schiff frowned, because mastery is flattering until it is paired with accountability. John Kennedy smiled briefly, because that was exactly the reaction he expected. John Kennedy said the third step in the sequence is amplification, where media enthusiasm fills gaps evidence has not yet closed. Adam Schiff said media does not take orders, and John Kennedy replied that media does take cues, especially from people who speak with institutional authority. John Kennedy said Adam Schiff's titles follow him into studios whether Adam Schiff wants them to or not. Adam Schiff protested that he cannot control headlines, and John Kennedy said leaders cannot control headlines, but they can control restraint. The room felt the logic settle because it was difficult to argue against responsibility without sounding evasive. John Kennedy then shifted to humor again, because humor disarms while it exposes. John Kennedy said Adam Schiff has been on television so often that some viewers might think the House Intelligence Committee has its own green room. A few senators chuckled before remembering they were supposed to remain neutral. Adam Schiff did not laugh, and John Kennedy said that was fine, because jokes land best when they are uncomfortably accurate. Adam Schiff accused John Kennedy of trivializing governance, and John Kennedy replied that trivialization happens when governance becomes branding. John Kennedy said the fourth step in the sequence is defense. When early claims harden into identity, Adam Schiff pushed back, saying convictions are not costumes, and John Kennedy said convictions should not be immune to revision. John Kennedy explained that once a politician ties personal credibility to a narrative, correction feels like surrender. Adam Schiff's posture tightened, because surrender is not a word he tolerates easily. John Kennedy said this is how positions become prisons, built brick by brick out of past statements. John Kennedy paused because he wanted viewers to sit with that image. John Kennedy said this prison does not just trap the speaker. It traps audiences who invested emotionally in the certainty. Adam Schiff said audiences can think for themselves, and John Kennedy replied that audiences often trust authority until authority proves careless. John Kennedy said disappointment is more corrosive than disagreement, because disappointment carries betrayal. Adam Schiff stared forward, because betrayal is not a comfortable accusation to absorb. John Kennedy said the fifth step is denial, which is the reflex that arrives when consequences surface. Adam Schiff insisted denial is a mischaracterization, and John Kennedy said denial can be subtle, like minimizing impact or shifting blame to misunderstanding. John Kennedy said denial often sounds like insisting critics are bad faith instead of engaging substance. Adam Schiff objected that criticism can be bad faith, and John Kennedy replied that bad faith accusations should not replace self-examination. The committee chair cleared his throat again, sensing the temperature rising. John Kennedy reassured the room that this was not about one party or one man, because that reassurance makes the critique harder to dismiss. John Kennedy said Adam Schiff is simply a visible example of a broader habit in Washington. Adam Schiff bristled because being an example is different from being an exception. John Kennedy said examples matter because people learn from them, and patterns replicate. Adam Schiff leaned back because leaning back is what you do when you feel targeted but cannot point to a falsehood. John Kennedy said the final step in the sequence is public fatigue. John Kennedy explained that fatigue sets in when people stop caring who is right and start assuming everyone is exaggerating. Adam Schiff argued that cynicism is dangerous, and John Kennedy agreed, then said cynicism is fed by overconfidence that never pays a price. John Kennedy said when everything is framed as existential, nothing feels repairable. The audience nodded because exhaustion is easier to recognize than ideology. John Kennedy turned another page in the binder and said he would not read names yet. Adam Schiff watched carefully because names change tone instantly. John Kennedy said before introducing specific examples, he wanted Adam Schiff to answer a simple question about responsibility. John Kennedy asked whether Adam Schiff believes public officials owe citizens not just passion, but proportionality. Adam Schiff hesitated, and John Kennedy said, hesitation is understandable because proportionality limits theater. John Kennedy leaned forward and said this was why the opening hook was harsh. John Kennedy said the hook was not personal, it was instructional, because audiences tune out polite warnings. Adam Schiff said the hook poisoned the well, and John Kennedy replied that wells are poisoned when trust evaporates, not when criticism is blunt. John Kennedy said viewers asking why he criticized Adam Schiff should stay to the end, because the reason is now unfolding in order. Adam Schiff exhaled slowly, because order is not where improvisers thrive. John Kennedy then addressed the camera directly, breaking the fourth wall just enough to hold attention. John Kennedy said, if you have ever felt confused watching confident claims dissolve without apology, this sequence explains why. Adam Schiff objected that this was editorializing, and John Kennedy replied that hearings are public for a reason. John Kennedy said, transparency includes allowing viewers to connect dots, not just consume conclusions. Adam Schiff looked away briefly, because eye contact is harder when the audience feels included. John Kennedy said the next part would introduce specific narratives, not to inflame, but to illustrate. Adam Schiff stiffened again, because illustration is where abstraction loses protection. John Kennedy said each example would be framed as opinion and public context, not accusation. John Kennedy said viewers should decide for themselves whether the pattern fits. Adam Schiff tightened his grip on the armrest, because the next section would test more than rhetoric. John Kennedy said this was the moment where theory meets consequence, because narratives only matter when they touch real lives. Adam Schiff adjusted his microphone, a small gesture that signaled readiness rather than comfort. John Kennedy reminded everyone that he would speak in opinions and public context, not allegations, because precision keeps the discussion legitimate. Adam Schiff nodded once, signaling acknowledgement without agreement. John Kennedy said disagreement was expected, but avoidance would be noticed. John Kennedy began with a measured example, describing how prolonged certainty shapes public trust over time. Adam Schiff listened carefully, because this was no longer about tone, but about impact. John Kennedy said when leaders speak with unwavering confidence, audiences internalize those statements as settled fact. Adam Schiff countered that leadership requires confidence, and John Kennedy replied that leadership also requires recalibration. The distinction landed quietly because it did not accuse, it contrasted. John Kennedy said viewers often assume corrections will arrive naturally if claims weaken. Adam Schiff said corrections do arrive through reports and clarifications, and John Kennedy said they rarely arrive with equal volume. John Kennedy explained that retractions whispered after megaphones do not restore balance. Adam Schiff frowned slightly, because imbalance is harder to justify than error. John Kennedy said this imbalance is where skepticism begins to rot into cynicism. John Kennedy shifted again, adding a layer of dry humor to steady the temperature. John Kennedy said the modern political cycle treats certainty like a subscription service, renewed automatically unless someone cancels it. A ripple of restrained laughter moved through the room. Adam Schiff did not smile, and John Kennedy said seriousness is appropriate when trust is at stake. John Kennedy clarified that humor was not dismissal, but emphasis. John Kennedy then framed a hypothetical familiar to many viewers. John Kennedy said, "Imagine a citizen watching nightly commentary, trusting the authority of the speaker because credentials suggest access to truth." Adam Schiff leaned forward, because hypotheticals often feel uncomfortably personal. John Kennedy said, "Now imagine that narrative slowly unraveling without acknowledgement, apology, or explanation." Adam Schiff remained silent, because silence avoids committing to a position. John Kennedy said the citizen does not feel informed in that moment. They feel misled. Adam Schiff argued that misinterpretation by audiences is unavoidable, and John Kennedy said that does not absolve responsibility. John Kennedy said trust is borrowed from the public and must be repaid with transparency. Adam Schiff crossed his arms because repayment implies debt. John Kennedy said debt accumulates quietly until it becomes crisis. John Kennedy emphasized that this discussion was not about partisan loyalty. John Kennedy said voters across ideologies share one expectation: that leaders adjust when facts evolve. Adam Schiff responded that evolution of facts is often contested, and John Kennedy agreed, adding that contestation does not excuse rigidity. John Kennedy said rigidity turns positions into performances. Adam Schiff objected that performance trivializes conviction, and John Kennedy said conviction should survive scrutiny. John Kennedy paused deliberately, allowing the silence to stretch. John Kennedy said this pause is what accountability feels like: uncomfortable and unresolved. Adam Schiff shifted in his chair, because unresolved moments resist spin. John Kennedy said, accountability is not punishment, it is alignment. Adam Schiff repeated that intentions matter, and John Kennedy replied that outcomes outlast intentions. John Kennedy then addressed the viewers again, drawing them further into the process. John Kennedy said, if you are asking why Adam Schiff is being criticized so directly, the answer is not personal animus. John Kennedy said the answer lies in visibility, because influence magnifies consequences. Adam Schiff objected that visibility is earned through service, and John Kennedy agreed, adding that visibility amplifies duty. The camera lingered, because duty is a word that carries weight. John Kennedy explained that when influential figures refuse recalibration, audiences learn a dangerous lesson. John Kennedy said they learned that certainty matters more than accuracy. Adam Schiff said certainty reassures during chaos. And John Kennedy replied that false reassurance creates deeper chaos later. John Kennedy said chaos deferred is chaos multiplied. Adam Schiff looked down briefly, because deferral is difficult to defend. John Kennedy returned to structure, grounding the narrative again. John Kennedy said this was only the first concrete illustration, and more would follow. Adam Schiff's jaw tightened, because repetition of examples compounds pressure. John Kennedy said each illustration would ask the same question: whether influence was exercised with proportional restraint. Adam Schiff exhaled through his nose, signaling tension rather than refutation. John Kennedy closed this section with a controlled reminder. John Kennedy said viewers should not rush to judgment, because judgment without sequence becomes reaction. Adam Schiff nodded slightly, because that advice applied universally. John Kennedy said, "Stay with the sequence, because clarity comes from accumulation." Adam Schiff remained silent, knowing the next part would sharpen the focus even further. John Kennedy said this was the point where the opening question finally gets answered, because unanswered questions breed suspicion. Adam Schiff looked directly at him, knowing the audience was waiting for resolution, not escalation. John Kennedy reminded viewers of the opening hook, the sharp criticism that pulled them in. John Kennedy said the criticism was never about humiliation. It was about illumination. Adam Schiff shifted slightly, because illumination exposes angles spin cannot cover. John Kennedy said viewers asked why Adam Schiff was singled out, and the answer is influence paired with inflexibility. John Kennedy said, when a voice carries institutional authority, its errors echo longer and louder. Adam Schiff argued that authority also brings burden, and John Kennedy agreed, saying burden demands restraint. John Kennedy said restraint is what separates leadership from performance. The room felt the distinction land, because performance is familiar to everyone watching politics. John Kennedy said, the real issue is not whether Adam Schiff believed what he said at the time. John Kennedy said, belief does not negate responsibility once facts shift. Adam Schiff responded that hindsight distorts judgment, and John Kennedy replied that accountability exists precisely because hindsight exists. John Kennedy said leaders are judged not by certainty at the start, but by honesty at the end. Adam Schiff remained quiet, because endings are harder to manage than openings. John Kennedy said the audience deserves a straight answer without theatrics. John Kennedy said Adam Schiff was criticized because he represents a pattern where correction never arrives. Adam Schiff objected that correction did arrive through reports and conclusions, and John Kennedy replied that correction without acknowledgement feels evasive. John Kennedy said silence after certainty is not neutrality, it is abandonment. The camera held steady, because this was the line viewers would remember. John Kennedy said, politics has trained audiences to expect deflection instead of reflection. Adam Schiff said reflection happens privately, and John Kennedy replied that public claims require public closure. John Kennedy said when millions hear certainty, millions deserve clarity later. Adam Schiff crossed his arms, because closure removes narrative control. John Kennedy said democracy does not belong to narrators. It belongs to citizens. John Kennedy addressed the viewers one last time, lowering his voice slightly. John Kennedy said if you stayed to the end, wondering why the criticism mattered, this is why. John Kennedy said trust is fragile, and leaders either repair it or exploit it. Adam Schiff looked forward, because looking back offers no refuge. John Kennedy said the critique was not meant to end a career, but to force a reckoning. John Kennedy said a reckoning does not require agreement, only honesty. Adam Schiff said honesty is subjective, and John Kennedy replied that humility is not. John Kennedy said humility is admitting when certainty outran evidence. Adam Schiff did not respond, because humility cannot be argued into existence. The room settled into a quiet that felt earned rather than imposed. John Kennedy concluded by returning to the role of the audience. John Kennedy said voters are not jurors in a courtroom, they are stewards of a system. Adam Schiff nodded faintly, because stewardship implies shared responsibility. John Kennedy said the purpose of this exchange was not to declare winners. John Kennedy said it was to remind everyone watching that power without recalibration corrodes trust. John Kennedy closed his binder, the sound soft but final. Adam Schiff gathered his papers more slowly than before. John Kennedy said the criticism began sharp because indifference is worse than anger. John Kennedy said if leaders cannot withstand scrutiny, they should reconsider the authority they wield. Adam Schiff sat back, knowing the audience had been given something harder than outrage, a sequence they could judge for themselves.